Welcome back. Today in this next episode I'm going to show you how to use ink, black ink. This is waterproof ink, so it's permanent. You have to be a little bit careful when you're purchasing inks because some are water-based and re-wettable, and you want something that's permanent like an acrylic ink or a permanent drawing ink. You can see some beautiful textures happening in the ink where it slightly separates. I'm using a watercolor paper. It's called Bahong watercolor paper, 300 grams, so it can get all the, it won't buckle in these sketchbooks. And if you see very carefully, there's some blue lines on that work, and the blue lines are actually masking fluid. The masking fluid is like a latex, it's rubber, and you apply it with a brush to keep the ink away off the paper. Be careful when you use it because you don't want to use your best brush, you want to use an old brush. If you leave this brush out and it gets dry, it's going to be really difficult to get off. So you'll see that I have to put that brush into the water continually, and you need soap to clean it off. So don't use your good brushes for this. I'm going to use a slightly broader brush so you can see, and I'm going to put that masking fluid on. I'm using a broad brush so you can see the lines, and basically wherever you put this masking fluid, you're going to resist the ink, you're going to protect the paper, and you can create, as you get used to using this, you can create textures with it. Next thing I'm going to show you are my inks. So I've told you that I'm using just drawing ink, and we're looking at tone. So tones are created by adding water to the ink. So what I've done is I've got these bottles. What I do is in each bottle I put a few drops of ink, and then I add water. This one that I've just put down here is number 2, and it's the darkest ink. This one's labelled number 3, and you'll see there's a little difference in tone. It gets a bit lighter. This one is number 4, lighter still. This one is number 5 and is the lightest. These are the shortcuts of tone that I'm going to use instead of constantly mixing the ink with water and trying to get the same tone. So you've got some sort of consistency. So number 2 being the darkest, the unnatural ink is number 1. Number 5 being the lightest, then it means the natural lighter colour is actually the white of the paper. Okay, I'm going to start off with number 5, which is my lightest ink, and I'm going to just put a wash over the top of the sky. I'm being entertained by the parrots in the background of my beautiful garden studio, which I love. I've put that wash in there. Bring it right down, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of soft kitchen towel, and I'm just going to work that a little bit over the top to create a little bit of variance to that sky, what will be the sky colour. You can get quite clever with that and almost work out some clouds. So there's a little bit of variance in the tonal work. You want to work from light to dark. So your dark values coming, or tones coming in right at the end. I'm going to go into number 4 and just come in on this little, the edge of that embankment, the cliff face there. And you'll see where it's rejected by the masking fluid that I've put in. And now going into number 3, darker still, and just adding a variance of dark in there. and up through the trees, where you can see a little bit of the bushland up through there, into number 3 again, and you can see the changes. Now ideally you're letting that probably dry off a little bit more than I am doing. I'm working very quickly for you so you can sort of get some instant results, but if you wait for it to dry off a little bit, you'll get more impact from the darker ink. If you let it dry completely, then you can get those very hard lines that between each value of the ink. So it's a lot of experimental stuff, so just play to begin with. Now I'm going to wash down the cliff face. I'm going back to my lightest tone, and I'm going to come down through this very light area at the top and bringing the ink downwards into the direction of the subject. And you can see a lot of rejection there from ink, and I'm going to actually cascade the whole of this down to the bottom and get it covered. Where the masking fluid is, you can see where the ink is being pushed back. Now I'm going into the darker value. The darker side of the subject's over here, so I'm just going to wash in around this area. Let the ink do its thing. Go into a darker value still, or tone. I'm going into number 2, which is our darkest one, and I'm just going to come in under here, which is the very sort of ridge, the edge of that top bit. You can see where it's rejecting a little bit, but it'll pick up all that paper. Here I'm going to start to work in through, and these dark tones that I've gone into will work in amongst the masking fluid and create those beautiful crevasses that you get, sort of big chinks in the rocks, those dark areas in the rock, and they'll naturally go in. I'm sort of looking at the subject, but to be honest with you, I'm sort of free flowing. This is your safety net, your little tissue. So here you can bring it back. This is a bit of kitchen towel. This one is a much firmer, scrubby tissue, and it sounds ridiculous that you've got to be rather pedantic about your tissue, but you do. Because if I scrunch that up and then push this in, you'll see it makes little textural marks into the ink. Probably not so clear on the video, but you'll see it clears out little areas. You can use all sorts of things to clear the ink out, little cotton tips, but I always end up with a tissue or these little felt, just to sort of push the ink up if it's got a bit too flooded. I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to go into this pure ink, and I always put it in a mixing dish, add a little bit of water, and I usually actually make sure that I have a little piece of paper beside me, and I test that ink out first. It's really important to test it because you don't quite know how solid it is. And I'm going to come in with this fine brush, and I'm going to start to bring that very dark ink in. Your dark ink is your drawing. It's the foundation of the drawing. It'll bring some solidity to your drawing. And I'm just going to come in here. I've got these beautiful trees, which I've actually put some masking fluid, but I'm actually going to follow that ink alongside, and you'll see that when I release that masking fluid off, you'll see that the white and the black work together to create those highlights. I'm also going to put a little bit in over the top of the trees here. Now with this demonstration, I'm not going to particularly complete it. You've seen the completed work. It's more important that you see me working with the pen rather than a finished result. This is really about the materials, how I build up. I spend a long time working on these, and I really enjoy this process of building up my subject before I even start touching a canvas. Again, your safety net are your tissues. You can blot the tops of those little trees back a little bit, and there you can see that you've got some sort of little pattern, and you've brought out the really solid black ink with the tissue. I'm going to just move down a little bit, and then we're going to pause for a while, and I'm just going to let that dry off just a bit so that I can reveal some of this masking fluid. I'm just drawing back in here. Again, we've got these trees. You can draw some extra trees in like that with it's a little bit wet. See how it's splaying out? It means it's a little bit too wet to go in with the ink, so let things dry off. If it starts to flood like that, let the ink dry off. Let it dry off completely and go in with your dry ink. So it's all about, you watercolourists will be fine because you kind of know about when to go in when it's dried off. But if you're experimenting and trying this method, you want to see what happens when you go wet in wet and what happens when you let it dry and you go in with your brush. But I kind of quite like that splayed look. So I'm going to pause there so that we can dry it off just a little bit, and I'm going to come back with the last part of this little bit of video and show you how I'm going to release some of that masking fluid off. Now I've let the piece dry off a little bit now so that we can start taking off the masking fluid. So the masking fluid is where the blue bits are. So I'm just literally, you can take just your thumb, finger, and just push it off, and you'll see that it reveals the paper. Bear with me while I rub away. You can see the effect it has. It has this, I'm just going to brush that away a little bit with, I'll use my hand, or you can just use another brush. And you can see that wow factor it has. It sort of reveals the white paper, and it starts to get really, really interesting when you do that. What I'm going to do is almost draw back into this with a pure ink, and it's dried off enough that it shouldn't splay out as much. You can use your ordinary drawing pens, but I love using this black ink, and I use it to start to draw the linear lines around the subject to bring a little bit of detail back into it. So I'm coming down here, I'm just going to bring that brush. I'm going to use a little bit of water. The water's going to move it. Remember, I can use one of these little felt pads to knock the ink out again, using your pure ink. I'm just going to come into a little bit of detail here. I don't want to cover all that white up that I've exposed. And I'm drawing back in to some of the marks that have been made. Left a little bit of drawing ink on, masking fluid on there. And I'm following the patterns that have been left behind, and I'm almost tracing those patterns. If I want to soften that a little bit, I just use a little water spray, and you can see it starts to drip away. Rinse your brush out. I'm going in with just a clean brush, but I'm going to pick some of that ink up. Just dance the brush around. Dry the brush off, which is why I've got this little felt pad here. Back in with my drawing. Pick a bit more ink up. So here with the grasses, I'm just going to come up onto this edge. Feathering that brush. You're still leaving that white exposure there. Rinse my brush out. Now I'm going to add one other ink, a white ink. And this is the white ink that I use, but you can get better ones. This is all right. But white ink is not really ink. It's just very, very opaque. but I use white ink, not always, but it can, I'm just going to put a little bit on, and white ink dries quite transparent. And it's a lovely sort of opaque addition to the drawing. So just in this area, I'm showing you a few little tricks that I use. Wet in wet. And you can see that the white ink takes a slightly different feel to it than just the white paper. Again, bringing in that rag just to blot that back a little bit, coming in under the tree, creating some foliage. And you can start to see how you're building up just that little area of the drawing. Obviously, these drawings take a good hour, and they're often done in the studio. I really enjoy them, and I really enjoy the experimental side of it. There are lots of different tricks that I can use, and I use water spray, alcohol spray, you can use salt, all sorts of things. But unfortunately, this is not the video for those. But happy to share with you some of the knowledge if you get in touch with me, and show you a little bit more in another video. Thanks very much.